if I were to tell you a place in the bottom of Raleigh that's so magnificent that 5Ks are run through it, that yoga, that cannons are fired up, that tours are conducted, that there's science festivals, stargazing, and more, that there are movies filmed, and news crews filming stories, and sacred moments happen every day. Where would you say this is? A church? A park?
A museum? Well, it's not a church, it's not a park, and it's not a traditional museum. It's historic Oakwood Cemetery. And do you know that cemeteries are important repositories not only for the dead, but for the living? If you're a nature buff or a bird watcher, or you like history or genealogy, then the cemetery is for you. Now, this is what people think about when they think about cemeteries, right? A funeral. That makes sense. It is Friday the 13th after all. And so you think about the procession and the flowers and the mourners and maybe even the 1928 version of me standing in the corner. But what about this? This is a cemetery as well. An 1830s painting with people walking through intentional paths and water elements and all kinds of people-friendly, living people-friendly scenes. Well, why was this kind of thing happening in a cemetery? I mean, that's a little odd. But it wasn't odd for people in the 1830s, the 1840s, the 50s, and 60s, because, see, when a Victorian cemetery was created, when that era type of cemetery was created, there were no city parks. So there was nowhere for people to stretch their legs outside, to socialize, and to interact with one another, except intentionally beautiful landscape cemeteries. So at these amazing places, these sacred grounds, people would picnic and families would go for carriage rides. And people would stop and smell the flowers and couples would go on dates because that is the only place they could go. It may seem strange to us, but it is what was done every day in the Victorian era. And Oakwood Cemetery truly became a cemetery full of life during this time. Now don't get me wrong. Every time a funeral comes on our grounds, which is about 5 times a week, we turn into this again. And all those fun activities come to a complete stop. Are we the only cemetery in this country that does this? I wish. But heck no. Cemeteries around the country and throughout Europe are reclaiming their rightful place as the lively role that they play in the life of their community. And I could say the life of their community. So what does that look like at Oakwood? At Oakwood, that looks like weddings on our grounds. I'm not kidding, weddings. Senior pictures, sometimes Enloe students have senior pictures taken. We have plays on our grounds. And we have wild foraging classes where people can go and eat the weeds at the cemetery. Interesting. How and why do people do these activities and how do cemeteries put these together? Historic cemeteries are outdoor museums. If you will indulge me with this, then you need to think about our artifacts as being the headstones, right? On a headstone, it'll tell you the name of the person. Perhaps it'll give you an idea of their birth and death date. And if you pay a lot of attention to these headstones, you might see information about commerce or art. You could glean some other information. But what a cemetery really teaches you is about social history, women's history, about military history, about the history of race in our community. Oakwood is truly an outdoor museum on 70 acres. Many people think there's nothing sadder than a cemetery, but that's wrong. There's nothing sadder than a cemetery with no visitors. And so activities, such as the ones I rattled off, are important for the life of the cemetery to welcome in our public, the visitors, the people who live in Raleigh, and so that the people who are buried here will live forever. It's important. What gives us the opportunity to do these type of activities is really pretty simple. It's not some complex thing. It's based on the people who are buried on our grounds. So if you were to go to a cemetery in Richmond, Virginia, their programs would look different because they are different people. So we're all a little individualized. Now, by walking through any cemetery, you can learn a lot about the basic facts. But if you listen a little more closely, you will learn a lot more about our community. So we're just going to listen tonight and learn a little bit more. This is my favorite person buried at Oakwood Cemetery. His name is Asa Forrest, and he was the cemetery's 3rd superintendent. He was hired in 1874, right? What's so interesting? Except he served in the Union Army for the Civil War, a northerner from New England who comes down to Raleigh to get a job, a carpetbagger we would call him, right? And he gets a job at what is predominantly in 1874 a Confederate cemetery. You think that goes over well in the city of Raleigh? No. And the people were up in arms. But they let him stay on the job, and he had that job for nearly 50 years. And by the time he dies of the Spanish flu in 1920, he was loved, cherished, respected, and treated as a native son. And he's pretty handsome. And here's Myrtle Mills Hilton, a Raleigh girl. Her brother is the founder of the Old Raleigh Boys Club. She becomes the first female stenographer for the United Nations. She's also a member of the OSS, which today we would call the CIA. And she becomes the stenographer for the War Crimes Tribunal of the trial of Tojo, the mastermind of Pearl Harbor. Here he is, standing next to her. They become friendly, strangely. And she begins to bring him his favorite candy bars during the trial. That raises a lot of eyebrows, here and during the trial, and where the trial took place. And Bobby Crocker. He's a high school student, like many of you. In his senior year at Raleigh High School, he gets drafted that fall for World War II. His parents go to the draft board. They ask for a deferment. It's not granted. But oh yeah, he happens to be the star quarterback of their football team. So they allow him to play one last half. He lets the team be in the lead, and then at halftime, he has to go to the train station to go to boot camp for the Marine Corps. Interestingly, the train station was right next to the football field. So as the train pulls out of the station, all of the people in the stadium wave goodbye. Gives me the chills. What a send-off that is. But here's the thing. He doesn't make it home. He's injured in the Pacific, but he has the wherewithal to have a letter written for his parents where he tells them he's injured, but he'll be okay. The letter arrives 4 days after his parents are notified of his passing. And during the turbulent 1960s, there are 2 men that help keep Raleigh together. J.D. Lewis and Ray Dr. Jocko Henderson. J.D. Lewis is a bit of the 1960s version of Ryan Seacrest, if you will. He had a TV show on WOAL called Teenage Frolics, and teenagers from around the South would come and dance to the tunes that he spun. And Dr. Jocko ends as a Motown executive, but starts as a Raleigh DJ. He knows and fully understands that music is the soundtrack to our soul. And if we could all just find the one thing that unifies us, in this case music, Raleigh was going to be okay. We have sports stars at Oakwood Cemetery. I don't know if any of you are NC State fans, but we have Lorenzo Charles, who made the national championship shot in 1983 for NC State University. And his beloved coach, Jimmy V, who told us to never give up. Oakwood Cemetery has an interesting start. Not a start like most cemeteries. Our permanent residents, many of them, had a cemetery that they belonged to and were buried in first. We start as a Confederate cemetery before Oakwood was even created. And our original 494 Confederate soldiers are moved in from what is now Raleigh National Cemetery. So they had an original burial ground. When Oakwood is chartered in 1869, it becomes such the hip place to be buried that families start moving their loved ones in, bodies and headstones left and right. It's why many of our headstones predate the cemetery itself. And we still move in cemeteries. be moved onto our grounds. In a few weeks, 60 people will come to us from another cemetery. This is a photograph of part of the process. Our most interesting recent move-ins were a group of sharecroppers that came from near Carter-Finley Stadium in Raleigh. We don't know much about them. We only know one of their names. We know they were formerly enslaved people who worked hard, worked the field, and a family member keeps calling us with tidbits of information, so we keep learning an awful lot. So you see how programs kind of present themselves at Oakwood? They kind of fall into our laps. We have 137 Gettysburg dead reburied in Oakwood in the 1870s. So on the 150th anniversary of the Gettysburg Battle, we did a huge program for 300 people where we talked about the battle itself and traced where North Carolina soldiers were during that time. We have a lot of doctors from the mid-1800s to late 1800s. So we partnered with the Country Doctor Museum from Bailey, North Carolina, and we did an event called Cure You or Kill You, where we highlighted some successful and some not so successful medicinal practices. Beaks is all I can say. And we have a lot of people who supported prohibition. Shouldn't surprise us. And so we did an event called the House of Intemperance, and we served mocktails at every stop of the people who did not agree with drinking alcohol. Monument art is a very big thing in Victorian-era cemeteries, right? They were always sending signals to each other about what monuments and what symbols meant to people at this time period. But two of our most intriguing monuments come from the modern era. These are the graves of Wade and Elizabeth Edwards. Wade's grave is 14 tons of American white marble, carved into the shape of a surrogate mourner, an angel, cradling the image of Wade's face in her hands. And on your right is Elizabeth Edwards, his mom, who has a 7-foot-tall marble monument of 27 doves being released by 2 hands. Breathtaking, moving. Walking through Oakwood Cemetery is like taking a tour of our own fine city, right? The first graves you see are William Stanhope Pullen's family. We're familiar with Pullen. He's the one who donated his land to become Pullen Park. And there'll be a lot of other names you'll recognize if you come to Oakwood. Here's William G. Enloe. He and his family are buried at Oakwood. Ironically, he's very close to Needham Broughton. I can't help it. If you've ever heard of Emma Kahn Elementary, then Emma Kahn is buried at Oakwood. She always said that her life must be exciting if they were going to name a school after her. And the elementary school, Sherwood Bates, named for Mamie Sherwood and Grace Bates, both of them rested at Oakwood as well. Mamie Sherwood and Grace Bates taught for over a combined total of 100 years for schools in Wake County. They were sisters, and they made this little vow to each other when they were children, that they never wanted to live a day without the other. I mean, impossible, right? Not so much. When Mamie Sherwood has a stroke and is rushed to the hospital unconscious, her son goes to his aunt's house, Grace, to tell her the bad news. When he gets there, Grace is dead. He returns back to the hospital, and his mother dies a few hours later, never having lived a day without the other. Cemeteries and the role they play in our lives are a complex issue. Let's not kid ourselves. They remind us of sad times. They remind us of wondering what's in the great beyond. And they make us think about maybe what we want for our final wishes. But what isn't complex is that cemeteries are interesting and unique places to visit. You can walk in any cemetery in any town and learn about the values of people, learn about what they liked and disliked, learn about the social norms of any community. So the next time you want to stretch your legs and you have a few minutes to spare,